Logan, what information out there states you grew up in an abusive household? Rchrd Sl. Wow, you're the second person to ask me that in the last month. That is, about my abusive household. This must be an internet thing, maybe. Anyways, as I recall, the only place I discussed my childhood was in an interview I did with the Comics Journal years ago. Maybe that is where this comes from. I don't think I did or would use the word abusive pertaining to myself, although my sister and mother might. I mean, I wouldn't want to trivialize the meaning of the word, but my father was not a happy man. He was angry and irrational and would often terrorize me and my brother and sister with violence or threats of violence. This was the mid-60s, and he was an old-school first-generation Sicilian with what they used to call a temper, so disciplining kids by hitting them was not as foreign as a concept as it is now, perhaps. I got hit with all kinds of things: belts, hairbrushes, pieces of wood, books, but even in my high school a few years later, kids would get spanked with a paddle in front of the class if they offended the teacher in some way. It was a different era. Anyways, I guess you can say my relationship with my father did mess me up a bit, because although there was cruelty and irrational behavior, nevertheless, my father is where I get almost all my creative side from. He knew how to draw, which always amazed me as a kid, and he had a love and knowledge of old movies and monsters and weird popular culture stuff that has come to define who I am, too. It's very complicated. It's rather one for the shrinks, I guess. Logan, was your father in an artistic field, or was drawing a hobby for him? Rchrd Sl. It was a hobby, but when you're a kid, even average drawing can seem like magic. I remember watching cartoons with him, and he was able to draw the characters that were on the TV as they appeared on the screen. That impressed me. I also remember my cousins watching in awe as he drew pictures of pirates or cowboys during one summer vacation. I think maybe that's when I realized it was considered cool. But he wasn't schooled in art, unless it was maybe some classes due to the GI Bill after World War II. He only had an 8th grade education and had done all this macho stuff like being in a post-war motorcycle gang a la the Wild Ones and being a lumberjack in the Pacific Northwest. I saw photos of all these adventures, or I may not have believed them myself. His drawing must have inspired me to do it myself, but I honestly don't remember a single word of encouragement or advice from him regarding art. Instead, my first real memory of being an artist was when my kindergarten teacher raved about a drawing I had done and showed it to another teacher in front of me, and they both cooed over it. I think I have that moment to blame on becoming an artist. Logan, when did you get into the horror and pop culture yourself? Was that an experience you shared with your dad, or just because you were around it, something you explored on your own? Rchrd Sl. I have no idea why I responded to monsters and scary stuff rather than, say, cowboys or baseball cards, enough to make it a lifelong interest. I have my pet psych theories, e.g., exposing myself to scary stuff helped me to conquer my fears of real life, etc. But I honestly don't know for sure. My brother and I started buying monster magazines when we were little, but he didn't become hooked like I did. My father would mention that he had seen King Kong and the original Phantom of the Opera with Lon Chaney when he was a kid, and I remember he liked them, but he liked old movies in general. It all seemed to be something specific to me. For example, I must have read lots of comics as a little kid, funny animals or whatever, but the first comic that made an impression on me, that made me sit up and take notice, was a Jack Kirby pre-hero Tales of Suspense comic. My brother and I bought all those pre-hero Marvel Atlas monster comics, and so we were in for the debut. We were there for the debut of the Fantastic Four and Spider-Man and the Hulk. I bought those too because I loved Kirby, though I wasn't really aware of who he was. I just recognized the style. But I always missed those Atlas monster comics. Similarly, I started clipping out Dick Tracy comics and putting them into a scrapbook when I was in the 5th grade. Again, I'm sure I was responding to the grotesque characters, the wild violence, and the borderline horror elements that was in those strips. As I grew older, I certainly tried more than once to outgrow monsters in comics and pop culture. I got an education. I spent more time concerned with music and girls, etc. I had a career as an illustrator, but I was continually discovering smart adult ways of looking at stuff, reading scholarly articles that took comics and horror seriously, for example, or seeing poetic adult horror movies like Eyes Without a Face, etc., etc. And I realized that this maybe weren't simply childish thrills I needed to outgrow. I became fascinated with meaning and subtext, but I also couldn't deny the visceral thrills either. I guess I finally reached a point where I felt such a deep kinship with the creators of the stuff I love that I knew I had to join. That I knew I had to join them. Logan. I've always thought of horror and fantasy as a safe outlet for a certain amount of bloodlust. Watching a war movie makes me sick to my stomach, but I could watch zombies all day. It's safe. It's never going to happen to me. Rchrd Sl Certainly from a young age, I was able to grasp that movies weren't real. From the very beginning, I understood that movies were entertainment, that they were created by writers and cinematographers and makeup artists and actors and so on. I assumed I'm not the only one. And as I got a little older, I could see that, in addition to entertainment, horror movies could serve as an outlet for our real-life fears. It's such a cliche, but it's like riding a roller coaster. When the ride is over, you feel braver and more alive for having survived. Then, beyond that, one can look at horror movies as modern-day folk tales, in that they are rich in the potential for analysis, as dreams almost, which can be interpreted and scrutinized as not only showing us our individual fears, but whatever our cultural or societal fears may have been at that time. I understand what you mean about war movies, but I've never had a problem with that fictional genre. I feel that for me, violent movies of any kind can offer a genuine catharsis. That's why the trend of PG-13 rated horror movies is so frustrating for audiences. On the other hand, the new trend of torture movies, Saw, Hostel, etc., though capturing a specific mood of our time, I suppose, aren't satisfying to me in particular. I think the reason is that I can sense that they were made to be over the top, but it doesn't feel like the filmmakers have any real obsessive need to explore this stuff. Most great horror directors find something inside themselves to use. Instead, it just feels like it's being done to make money and exploit horror fans. I may be wrong, but that's how it's looking to me now. I'm not a big fan of the true crime segment horror. It's become more and more common for people who are horror fans to also be fans of real-life killers like Manson, etc. I have no problem with fictionalized versions of real-life crimes, but my feeling that, for the most part, if you're into that sort of thing, your interest is in true crime, not the horror genre. I could never confuse Charles Manson or Ted Bundy with Frankenstein and Freddy Krueger, but it seems like the line has blurred for some people. Naturally, I find true crime fascinating, but I couldn't ever really call it entertainment or even a safe outlet for anyone's fears. It's usually the opposite, for me anyways.